Well, welcome to our latest CEME podcast. My name is Richard Turnbull and I'm the Director of the Centre for Enterprise Markets and Ethics. And with me today is Graeme Leach, Professor Graeme Leach, Visiting Professor of Economics at the University of Lincoln, former Chief Economist of the Institute of Directors, and also a member of the Institute of Economic Affairs Shadow Monetary Policy Committee. And Graeme is with me today to discuss and to have conversation about God and economics. Graeme, it's a real pleasure and delight to see you and to be able to engage in this conversation with you. Why don't you...
Great to be with you. I'm so looking forward to our chat.
Yeah. Why don't we start, Graeme, by you giving an overview of how you see the Bible and its relationship to economics. Is it even possible to draw out a plan or a framework from the biblical witness?
Well, there are many who would say you can't do it. There's a school of thought that says it's targeted as an agrarian economy of a few thousand years ago and not to a modern advanced economy based on services and technology. So there is a very strong school of thought which influences Christian views, and so therefore Christian tends often to skirt around the subject. I mean, how often do you see a sermon on a biblical view of the economy? Yeah. I don't think I've ever attended one.
Not very often.
Not very often. No. And if you do, I suspect that the sermon is based on a bit of cherry picking of one or two pieces of scripture, which is then used to build up an entire school of thought, or so the God advocates big government, or God advocates this. Whereas actually I think the answer is that the Bible does speak. It speaks very clearly, actually. You've just got to look for it. And I think we've got out of the habit of looking for what God wants us to do on the economic front.
So where would you look? Where would you take us?
I would start at the beginning in the Old Testament. I think there's a lot to be learned from literally right at the beginning. Secular economics says economics as a school of thought began with Adam Smith. Actually, you could argue that it actually began with Adam, because in the Garden of Eden there was freedom. Man walked with God. God was encouraging the cultural mandate to go forth and multiply. One can imagine the interaction between man and God in that environment, and the tremendous innovation and creativity which would have ensued.
And indeed, all those raw materials that are listed in Genesis, including gold and water and precious stones, all there right at the beginning. There's
no shortage there. And if I'm writing a book, as you know, at the moment called Theoclassical Economics, and one of the things we look at in one of the opening chapters is, okay, this is, what did the Edenic economy look like? Now, the obvious answer is very small, but just thinking beyond the principles, what God has supplied there. And it's also, there's no shortage of ideas. God's ideas were manifest in 6 days in the creation, but he's also given us an amazing capacity for creativity. So actually, we will never run out of ideas for economic growth and wealth. It's just pursuing those and finding them. So I would argue, and there's a lot more detail in there, that freedom, the economy began in the Bible, but then, of course, something big happened. The big thing was the fall. And at that point, God kind of steps out of the production function, as it were. He's no longer walking with man in the garden. There's no longer that interaction. How do you build cement, Lord? Or how do you make this? Those sort of things would have happened, but could never happen because of the fall. And the post-fall world is very different, obviously. The ground is cursed, work is toil, and God steps back. But the problem is, as God steps back, man still needs something. There's a God-shaped hole there, and man turned to fill that gap all too often with government. But one of the amazing things is, God actually even then doesn't, even with the fall, really initially, yes, we see with Babel and Nimrod and everything that went on there was rebellion, but God actually, for his chosen people, didn't even want a governmental structure. He didn't want that centralized thing. We had the judges.
It's rather interesting, isn't it, that there we have that view in that picture that government wasn't really a divine, it was permitted rather than required, if you like, in the divine dispensation. But we today seem to fall into that trap of thinking it's the answer to every question. So say a little bit more then about what the Bible teaches us about government and its role and so on?
There's clearly government has ordained a function, but it is a very limited function. And we often forget actually that people think when they go from the Old to the New Testament that somehow, Jesus is a socialist, so that's kind of all that Old Testament stuff about limited government, we can push that aside. Jesus is a socialist because he was so compassionate and so caring, and this idea gets instilled in Christian minds that big government equals compassion, when it doesn't. In actual fact, if you look in the New Testament, if you look in Romans, if you look in 1 Peter, when Paul is talking about the role for government, it is a very limited, it is a super minimalist model of government. Government is there, ordained by God, to suppress evil. And beyond that remit, well, I can't find it in the Bible. There's no expository evidence for statism in the Bible whatsoever. And that is the fundamental thing which we miss in the modern world. I think collectively, the modern psyche has become so corrupted that now we can't even recognize them as basic things to do with God's economy. And that goes back to the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not steal. That has profound implications for property rights, and property rights are very, very strong in God's order.
In fact, if that were not the case, there would be no need for the commandment, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet.
Indeed. But as I say, property rights gets two commandments, thou shalt not steal and thou shalt not covet. Thou shalt not covet has massive implications. Think of it today. Economic policy is all about equality and the redistribution, and don't get me of income and wealth. And don't get me wrong, God's heart for the poor is overwhelming, but it is not what I would call a coercive heart. It is not substituted by government. It is about us. We are to be the good Samaritan to our neighbours. And what we miss, because everybody looks to government, and people see there's envy there as well as part of redistribution. People see what some have got and want that as well. But we are imposing a coercive response on that. God wants us, those who have plenty, to have a responsibility to help those who don't. But it is a voluntary, it's voluntary. Lord loves a cheerful giver and a voluntary giver.
I mean, it's usually characterised, isn't it, as the voluntary principle.
Yes.
And if you look at the history of Christian social provision, it's the Christian churches that have been responsible for providing hospitals, for providing schools, for providing welfare. And it seems that we've lost sight of that in our current dispensation.
And the thing we miss is, I think, the first thing is that welfare before the welfare state was actually far more pervasive than people think. It wasn't as all-pervasive as the modern state-supplied welfare. But we forget and we think, that's the difference. That was pre-state, now pre-state. But we're looking at the wrong thing. We're comparing apples and pears. Because back then, the economy wasn't as developed. The ability to provide for voluntary welfare through churches, through charitables, through NGOs, was not there as much. Incomes weren't as great, so there wasn't as much money to spend in those areas, to give away. The Good Samaritan was operating in a much smaller economy. In a modern economy, just think about it. Now, if it's never going to happen, but the transitional issues are too immense. But if there was the state withdrawal and the church stepped forward, think of that opportunity to witness for Christ. Think of that opportunity to show love to our neighbour. When there's a problem, you wade in with your neighbour. Think of those bonds of love, the social capital which would build up in society. We talk about the loss of community and people blame it on capitalism. That's just rubbish. Our loss of community is because love has been crowded out by state bureaucracy.
And our tendency is to step back and think, no, I've paid my taxes, that's the responsibility of government, it's not my responsibility. But let me take you back to this issue of limited government. If government in the Bible has limited functions, then that has implications, doesn't it, for taxation? And the levels of taxation that would be acceptable, and the nature and the type. Any thoughts on that?
Well, you and I have talked before. I've got this idea of what I call the economic trinity. And the economic trinity is the strength of property rights, it's a voluntary welfare system, and it's a proportional tax system. The tithe wasn't a tax, but there is a proportional principle we can learn from there. And the reason I cite those three in answer to your question is that they all act as a constraint on the growth of government. Property rights limits taxation. Strong property rights and the constraints on government there for spending are immense. At the same time, the voluntary welfare principle means that there isn't the government, the biggest area of public spending is that.
Social welfare.
So that reduces the need for taxation and public spending. And at the same time, it's not just the absolute amount. The amazing thing about God's economy and the brilliance of it is, because he's clearly the father of economics, is that actually...
not Adam Smith?
Yes, it ultimately precedes Adam. And the voluntary principle, the property rights idea, and this proportional principle. And the proportional principle actually says that even if you do have tax, I'm going to limit the distortion of that tax system. There's not a progressive tax system which is going to take more and more. And by the way, I treat all my children equally. I don't believe in punishing somebody more because they've got higher incomes. God will say, but I do believe my children have got a responsibility to help my other children, but I am not going to force them. Just as God doesn't make us love him, so he's not going to make us love our neighbour. He wants us to do it voluntarily. And that freedom, that free choice, that goes back to the Garden of Eden. You could say as well that eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good versus evil, that was kind of man searching for reason beyond God's guidance. And that's really all people do today. The statism in our society is looking to government instead of God as a source of reason, and a source of fatherhood. There's that vacuum. When God withdrew, something had to fill it. Now God actually says, even then, with his chosen people, and if what he's done with his chosen people in the Old Testament, I think is a pretty good guide as to how he does think a government should function. So when he says you are sort of alone now, I've thrown you out of the garden, he's at the same time also doesn't say you need loads of government. He leaves it with the judges, and then we get to 1 Samuel 8 where Samuel's giving the warnings, but God says, okay, I'm going to do it, but this basically is a punishment on you. Then we see all the consequences of that through the rest of the Old Testament. Everything that was said would happen did happen in terms of, but God says, right, you've got a limited function. So there is taxation, legitimate taxation to cover, but he's pretty reluctant, on that front, to cover these very, very limited law and order, justice, defence things. But these aren't huge areas. If you applied, in my opinion, if you applied the biblical model to today, then public spending would not be just above 40% of GDP. It would be less than 10% of GDP.
Your generosity knows no bounds, Graeme. From 40% to 10%.
But now that is in modern contemporary terms, that is austerity. The problem is now, because we've got such some statism and everybody looks to government, if the government steps back, nobody has any notion of a responsibility to step forward. So at the moment, if the government steps back, it creates huge issues. And that's what I call the transitional difficulties. How the heck do we get from where we are to where we should be? I honestly don't. That requires a miracle.
A couple of other questions, if I may, Graeme. First of all, in this complex economy that we're in, where people see bad behaviour in the marketplace, or they see greed and recoil against that, what can the Christian faith offer to the economy of today in terms of ethics and behaviour?
Well, I think a little bit, first of all, a bit of truth, and that is that actually if you really study the origins of the free market, if you really study how an economy works, then you very quickly realise that it's not based on greed. The greed myth, we saw it in Gordon Gekko and Michael Douglas in the 1980s, and we saw it later in Wolf of Wall Street in recent years, where it is very much, capitalism is all about greed. There is greed and selfishness in any economy, be it capitalist, be it communist. There is greed and selfishness. The problem is not with the system in a capitalist or free market sense. The problem is with people who won't obey God's rules
So
for
it's
operating
the misbehaviour of the actors due to sin and so on.
Ultimately, free market is all about service.
Yeah.
It is all about producing something, a good or service that other people want. It is about freedom of choice in the marketplace, whereby millions of people, all independently and separately, make decisions about what they want, and voluntarily. You buy your sandwich from Pret a Manger or Marks and Spencer.
How did you know I bought my sandwich from Pret a Manger?
Gift of Paul. It's a free choice. Nobody makes us do that. Nobody makes you buy a Samsung versus a Sony television. You have that choice. And the miracle of God's creation through the price system is that all coordinates and works and feeds out.
For the common good.
Yeah, for the common good. Now, everybody says, the invisible hand, it's all about. Adam Smith wrote in The Wealth of Nations, all he wrote about was, selfishness, that the economy was rooted. Absolute rubbish. He wrote about self-interest. And in actual fact, although he was more of a deist, I don't think he was a Christian. No. There are those who say he was very heavily influenced by a Christian worldview. And before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is all about a sense of ought towards others and those around us. So he wasn't this rabid selfishness advocate. And some are. I don't necessarily agree with all of Ayn Rand's philosophy, which I think at times is pure selfishness. But you don't need greed and selfishness to defend the free market. Actually, the ultimate moral argument is very simple. If God says, that's my model, that's moral for me.
So Graeme, what would you say to the young woman or the young man coming to you today for advice as they went into the world of business, went into the world of the market? What advice would you give to that young Christian woman or young Christian man?
I think you should really be proud of what you're going to do out there in the workplace, because God created us in his image. He gave us all skills and creativity to pursue that calling. And if that's God's calling for you in your life, then you do it. Now, the free market is not freedom from God-ordained rules of behaviour. So set an example for those around you in your honesty and your integrity, and your care for your staff, whilst at the same time not being ashamed to pursue a profit. Because if you make a profit, you can invest that in more, and ultimately you will create wealth and prosperity for the whole of society. So don't be ashamed of it. Reflect Jesus in all that you do, and watch it be blessed.
Graeme, we could talk for a lot longer, but thank you for your clarity of thinking. Thank you for the fact you've even thought about some of these questions. And I hope that those watching this podcast will appreciate that and will enjoy it and be stimulated to further debate and discussion. So Graeme Leach, thank you very much indeed for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Richard.